Hi, and welcome to Nevaeh's Nightmare. And on this episode, we are going to be covering Albert K. Bender and the Men in Black. If you are familiar with anything dealing with UFO lore in the last 70 plus years, you may have heard of the Men in Black. Likely, you have heard of the popular science fiction comedy movies that came out in the 1990s starring Will Smith that portrayed men in black as good guys protecting Earth from potential alien invasion. But what are the Men in Black? Are they government agents warning people not to ask too many questions about UFOs? Or are they actual aliens disguised as humans trying to warn people off? Or are they something else entirely? One question that doesn't often get asked is just where did the mythology of these strange beings come from? The answer is they come from the strange experiences of one man, Albert K. Bender. Albert K. Bender was born in 1921 and was from the small town of Doria, Pennsylvania. Albert had a fairly normal family life, but he also had an all consuming interest in horror movies, science fiction, and the occult. After serving stateside during World War II, Albert moved to Bridgeport, Connecticut, and he began to have an interest in UFOs that became all consuming. Sometime in 1952, Albert founded one of the first mail order UFO societies that he called the International Flying Saucer Bureau, or IFSB for short. The organization soon began to gather followers from all across the country. Albert soon published a newsletter called Space Review for the members, and in March of 1953, he came up with an interesting idea. Albert's idea was to try to contact the pilots of the UFOs by sending a telepathic message. This would require all of the members of the IFSB to send a telepathic message to the Space Brothers. Albert devised a World Contact Day for March 15th, 1953, where everyone would send the same message in their heads at the same time. The message read, calling occupants of interplanetary craft that have been observing our planet Earth. We of IFSB wish to make contact with you. We are your friends and would like to make an appearance here on Earth. Your presence before us will be welcomed with utmost friendship. We will do all in our power to promote mutual understanding between your people and the people of Earth. Please come in peace and help us in our earthly problems. Give us some sign that you may have received our message. Be responsible for creating a miracle here on our planet to wake up the ignorant ones to reality. Let us hear from you. We are your friends. By the way, Albert's message would become a big basis for the 1976 song Calling Occupants from Interplanetary Craft by the Canadian rock band Plateau and would become a big hit for the Carpenters in 1977. But back to Albert Bender. After the telepathic experiment, he planned to reveal that he knew the solution to the mystery of flying saucers. However, in the October issue of Space Review, he pulled the plug on the newsletter and the organization, stating that he knew what the mystery was, but wasn't going to reveal it as he had been warned off by a higher power. He also advised people engaged in saucer work to be very cautious. He then disappeared completely from the field of ufology and he told close friends that a massive flying saucer attack would take place soon. He believed that the attack wouldn't be from outer space, but rather from the inside of the Earth itself. Something had very clearly spooked Albert Bender away from studying or wanting to have anything to do with flying saucers. What had happened to Albert Bender to make him so scared and paranoid that he dropped everything? To answer that question, we have to go back up a little bit in the story. While he was publishing Space Review and heading up in the IFSB in 1952 and 1953, Albert moved back in with his stepfather in Pennsylvania and set up shop in the attic. In the attic, he had decorated the wall and ceiling with horror movie and occult imagery, which he called the space his Chamber of Horrors. UFOs were not the only interest that Albert had, as he was also studying various aspects of occultism at the time, and this may have had influence on the weird events that began to transpire in his life, but we'll come back to that later. Shortly after founding the IFSB in 1952, Albert began to receive phone calls consisting of weird beeping sounds and sometimes voices that told him he needed to leave the subject of UFOs alone. One evening, he was walking up to his chamber of horrors and saw a strange blue light emanating from the door. When he walked in, he smelled sulfur that covered the room and found that all of his records had been scattered around the room. This was minor to what was next to happen. One night, Albert went to see a movie. The theater was completely empty except for himself. Suddenly, he felt as if someone was staring at him from across the room. He turned around and looked and saw a shadowy figure looking at him. The figure was gazing at him with glowing eyes, and Albert closed his eyes and opened them, and the figure disappeared. And when he closed and opened his eyes again, the shadowy figure reappeared. Spooked out of his mind, Bender ran out of the theater and onto the street where he had briefly encountered the being again, and then he ran all the way back home, terrified. Soon after this incident, Albert was preparing for the events of World Contact Day when an entity materialized right in front of him in the attic. He once again saw the blue light, but this time he could also see a body beginning to come out of the light. Albert called out to it, demanding that it identify itself, but the entity faded away into the darkness. Once again, the stench of sulfur lingered in the air after this encounter. On the evening of World Contact Day itself, Albert was repeating the telepathic message over and over in his mind in order to contact the Space Brothers. Instead of a Space Brother, he encountered another entity. This entity was another shadowy figure that came out of a yellowish mist that commanded Albert to stop his investigations into the mysteries of the universe. In July of 1953, Albert Bender had the experience that finally broke him and shook him to his core. After returning from a long trip, he went to bed and he woke up in the middle of the night, not able to move. He saw three entities enter the room that he could see fully and looked very human. They were wearing black spherical robes and seemed to be almost wearing Homburg hats. They were also floating several feet off the floor. The strange beings told Albert that they would reveal hidden and forbidden knowledge to him and gave him a coin that he could use to contact them over the radio. Then, as abruptly as they appeared, they disappeared. Shaken by this, but still curious, he used the coin to contact the three men, and he later recounted that he was abducted and taken to the planet Kazakh, where he had a strange encounter with three female aliens. He was then taken back to Earth and told that he must not discuss what he had seen, and also that he was to stop the study of flying saucers immediately. Soon after this, Albert dropped everything to do with his newsletter and the IFSB. What had happened to Albert K. Bender? What really was the nature of these experiences that he had? Often the men in black are depicted as physical beings grounded in some sort of physical reality. However, in Albert's case, there was clearly a more supernatural element at work. These beings were more like what's described in sleep paralysis cases, when people see shadowy figures with some even wearing hats. In fact, there are people around the world who claim that they have seen an entity known as the Hat Man, which resembles the hats worn by the men in black. This is apparently what Albert Bender saw as well before his final visitation from the three men who were more physical in nature. How did this contact with the men in black start in Albert Bender's life? Remember when I said he had a fascination with the occult? Occultist Ren Collar theorizes that Bender had actually started to practice occult rituals when he wasn't writing about UFOs. Collar points out that this telepathic message used for World Contact Day is very similar to the conjuration to call forth any of the aforesaid spirits from the Lesser Key of Solomon, which is a book used to call on a discarnated entity. Also, remember that Bender had on one of his first experiences with an entity after repeating the World Contact Day message in his head over and over. It is possible that Bender conjured up some entities that had masqueraded themselves into the guise of alien beings and gave him a warning not to continue what he was doing. And this shook Bender to his core, and he got out of the UFO game. But this wasn't the last people would hear from Albert Bender. In 1956, Gray Barker published the book They Knew Too Much About Flying Saucers, and in it he recounted Albert Bender's story. In 1963, Barker also published Bender's account of what he had experienced called Flying Saucers and the Three Men. After this, however, Bender dropped out from the UFO field, choosing to distance himself from it entirely and dedicating himself to music. We may never know what exactly happened to Albert Bender in 1953, but one thing we do know is that from that point on, men in black became known in the UFO world, and other researchers began to encounter them and their bizarre threats and behaviors. From the UFO underground, they seeped into popular consciousness, and all because of Albert Bender's strange, unearthly experiences in his Chamber of Horrors. Thank you so much for watching this episode. Make sure to like, comment, subscribe, and let me know of what you think about Albert Bender. Was it sleep paralysis or was it potentially the Men in Black? Let me know in the comments below.